Monster Hunter Rise is the latest Monster Hunter game directed by Yasunori Ishinose, the director of the previous portable entries in the series. This is an important bit of information to know, as the philosophy behind designing the portable games and the console games has always been quite different, and has only become even more different with time. You see, the mainline Monster Hunter team tends to focus on delivering an immersive experience that really pushes the genre forward, the new step in evolution for the franchise, if you will. Meanwhile, the portable team focuses on taking the new elements established in the latest mainline entry and creating a more streamlined pick-up-and-play action-focused experience that could work great on handheld consoles. For this reason, Monster Hunter Rise is in a weird place. The game marks the first time a portable game has been available alongside the mainline entry on the same platform, a platform that isn't portable. Monster Hunter Rise has been very clearly designed with the Switch's portability in mind, and for that reason your experience with the game will vary greatly depending on how much you take advantage of said portability. But what of the PC, a platform with no portability, a platform the game was clearly not designed for? It's interesting that out of all of the portable games, the one which was designed the most for portability is also the one with the most avenues for it to be played non-portably. If you think about it, there's a large portion of Switch players who mainly play in docked mode and rarely if ever go handheld. Yet this game does not take into account those people with designs so focused on giving you the best portable experience possible, it forgets to give a worthwhile experience to those who reject the portable aspect of the Switch, and especially those with access to Monster Hunter World. On the PC, Monster Hunter Rise will always live under a shadow, an overwhelming, inescapable shadow, the shadow of Monster Hunter World, a game designed to push the series forward, a game designed for a platform like the PC. This is why this review has started out so strangely. I mean, I haven't even talked about the actual game yet, and that's because my level of recommendation for this game depends a lot on your experience with Monster Hunter World. Currently, as of the time of recording, Monster Hunter World base game is half the price of Rise, and Monster Hunter World Iceborne Master Edition, which includes both the base game and Iceborne, the massive expansion, is the same price as Monster Hunter Rise, and it's not even on sale right now. So right now, if you're on PC, under no circumstances would I recommend Monster Hunter Rise over World if you're thinking of getting into the franchise for the first time and don't know which game to pick. World is not only a better game in my opinion, but also just better value for your money. This leaves three kinds of people. First, people who have already done everything there is to do in World and want a new Monster Hunter game to play. Second, the people who fell off of World for one reason or another and are thinking of giving the series a second shot with Rise. And third, people who have already played Rise on Switch and want to upgrade to the technically superior PC port. And speaking of which, I think it's time this review begins for real. It's no secret how dated the Switch's hardware is, which makes it all the more impressive that Monster Hunter Rise looks pretty damn good for a Switch game, but that statement no longer really applies on PC. The game looks good, period. Pumping up that resolution to 1080p or 4K running at a smooth 144 FPS with the graphics settings on high is like getting glasses for the first time. Everything's so clear, so smooth, it's truly incredible, and while it doesn't reach anywhere near World's graphical fidelity, that's a given, and stylistically, depending on who you ask, this game is better than World, which is quite a feat. The game looks solid, and while not impressive or particularly beautiful in any areas, if you really enjoy the sort of Japanese aesthetic, you're really gonna dig this game's look. I do have some criticisms though. The color scheme is kinda dry in some places, the maps are very bland, and the textures, well, let's say they leave quite a lot to be desired, but still, Capcom's effort to make the prettiest game possible on the shittiest hardware possible cannot be understated, and honestly, this PC port is as good as it gets. Perfectly optimized, and all the improvements you'd expect from any good PC port are there. Good job, Capcom. The beginning of this video made it no secret that I'm not too fond of Monster Hunter Rise, but that doesn't mean I don't think it's a good game. And also, general public opinion on this game is that it's fantastic, and there is a reason for this. Monster Hunter Rise does a lot of good, so that's what I'm gonna be talking about now. What Monster Hunter Rise does good. Monster Hunter Rise is an action RPG with combat in the top of its class. It offers 45 unique boss fights and 14 weapon classes that play completely differently. On top of this, there are a wide variety of switch skills that you can equip to each weapon that can drastically change your playstyle. The game also offers an insane amount of weapons and armor, all with different stats and skills to collect and wear. And to wrap a nice little bow around all of this amazing stuff, the game includes the never-before-seen Wirebug system, allowing for a Monster Hunter experience like no other. If you're looking for an action RPG, hell, if you're looking for an action game period, there are very few other games that can deliver to you a better product and experience than Monster Hunter Rise. And that's because Monster Hunter is good, and that will probably never stop being the case. All of the amazing things that Rise does are things that every Monster Hunter game does. The large roster of bosses, the 14 different weapon classes, the huge amount of armor and weapons to collect, and of course, the combat at the top of its class. There are few things objectively bad about Rise, but the game does make a series of design decisions that I am not quite a fan of and that I think negatively affect the experience as a whole. So let's get on to that. So Rise adds a grappling hook to Monster Hunter, except it's a grappling hook that's connected to this little bug thing and it can just attach to the air. It's a pretty cool concept, not gonna lie, but just being cool doesn't cut it. So how does this thing work and how does it affect gameplay? Well, turns out it changes the pace of combat quite a lot, and what stresses me the most out of this is it didn't really have to. Let me explain. The Wirebug has 4 different uses. Use number 1 is for traversal. This is great. It controls really well, it has a nice learning curve, and overall it's a very well designed movement system. The Wirebug's second use is combat. Silkbind attacks to be specific. These are a set of special moves that differ by weapon and can also sometimes be interchanged with other unlockable skills. These cost 1 or 2 Wirebugs, and then the Wirebug takes a certain amount of time to refill depending on the move. Think of them as cooldown attacks in a typical action RPG. What makes these skills interesting though is they all pull from the same resource pool, which is also the same resource pool that the Wirebug's traversal options pull from. This promotes fast-paced decision making in the middle of combat, which is nice. I have no issue with these skills as a concept, it's just in execution, they kinda fail a little bit. The previous portable team game, Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, had a similar system called Hunter Arts. The main difference is each of the skills recharge in relation to how much damage you've dealt, meaning you can't use them as your main form of attack. So even if you have a very powerful Hunter Art, like let's say Trans/3 on the switch axe, not only is it hard to land, but you can't focus your playstyle around finding openings to land this move, precisely because you need to deal quite a lot of damage before this thing fills up. This isn't always the case in Rise. Let's look at the hammer for example. One of the hammer's Silkbind attacks is a big aerial slam called Impact Trader. This move costs 2 Wirebugs and has about a 25-second cooldown. Keep in mind this is the hammer's highest damaging move and it has a very little risk of use since a clean hit to the head will almost always stagger. But 25 seconds is fine, a decent amount of time in between uses, so where's the problem? Well, watch what happens when we pick up a 3rd Wirebug. Yeah, you can basically spam this move as much as you want, which makes effective play with the hammer boil down to just picking up a Wirebug and going ham. It doesn't help that the damage on all of the hammer's other moves pales in comparison to not just the damage of Impact Crater, but the damage of other weapons in general. So this creates a playstyle that's completely based on spamming one special attack that's on a cooldown. And as anyone should know, relying on spamming cooldown attacks for the bulk of your damage is never a good thing in an action game. Satisfying combat comes from the player's ability to adapt and perform different actions depending on the situation. Devil May Cry's combat wouldn't be so good if all you had to do was spam Stinger. Hammer isn't the only weapon with this problem. The longsword Spirit Helm Break was buffed in Rise. It was made incredibly easy to land, but to counteract this, it was also made into a Silkbind attack. A Silkbind attack with an incredibly short cooldown. And since Spirit Helm Break isn't really something that you spam since you have to be in red gauge to utilize it to its full potential, this means that nearly every time you need it, it will be available even if you don't have a third Wirebug. This means that they took an incredibly powerful attack that was balanced by how much skill it took to land consistently and frequently, and they made it so that everyone can land it consistently and frequently. This is a direct consequence of how Capcom decided to balance the Silkbind attack system, and the list goes on. The Charge Blade's counter peak performance makes filling up files a joke. The Lightbowgun's Power Slide is a terrible ability that gives you a slight raw boost, making it sort of a mandatory skill that you have to actively maintain, and the Gunlance Ground Splitter is another skill you have to constantly perform maintenance on. My point is, not much thought went into balancing these attacks, making a lot of the weapons a mere husk of their former selves in terms of their depth and complexity. Now onto the third use of the Wirebugs, the Wyvern Riding. In Monster Hunter Rise, the mounting system from the previous games was completely revamped and replaced with Wyvern Riding, which is a system in which after doing a certain amount of aerial damage or damage from a Silkbind attack, the monster will become rideable. At which point you can use its attacks to attack other monsters, make other monsters rideable, or just bang it against the wall a couple times. Apart from the player-triggered Wyvern Riding, once during every quest, or at least most quests, a monster will interfere in the fight and either become rideable or make the monster you are fighting rideable. This is a very, very flawed system because it interrupts the flow of combat, and this would be fine if it was optional, but no, at least once during every quest you will have to Wyvern ride something. That or you sit there and wait for like 15 seconds, which let's face it, you're not gonna do because just riding them and crashing them into a wall is faster than waiting for the monster to become damageable again. Mounting used to be something you chose to do. You had to deliberately go for aerial attacks in order to mount. This not only made it feel very rewarding since you purposefully decided to try and mount it, but this also added another layer of decision making. How much will I benefit from attempting to mount the monster versus just continuing to damage it normally? In Rise, none of this is there. Wyvern riding basically boils down to just being a scripted event. Hell, in the final boss there is literally a scripted riding event, and the entire fight itself feels very scripted, but I won't get into that as to avoid spoilers. The second major issue with Wyvern riding is that it's very, very powerful. Even if it wasn't mandatory, meaning you could damage the monster to cancel it out of its rideable state, there would still be no reason to do so unless you're doing a TA speedrun, because the amount of free damage you get from Wyvern riding is insane. Just a single Wyvern ride with Magnamolo or Rajang can do up to 20% of Teostra's HP. That's over 4,000 free damage on a monster. Check out this video from Team Darkside in which Visery kills a high-rank Magnamolo in 8 minutes and 47 seconds only using Wyvern riding. It is very unbalanced, and Capcom most likely didn't intend for this to be this way, but maybe they should have thought about this mechanic a little bit more before adding it. Now finally we get into the fourth and arguably most controversial use of the Wirebug, the Wirefall. In Rise, when you get hit and knocked into the ground, you can get back up instantly at the cost of simply one Wirebug. As you can probably guess, this completely changes the pace of combat, and this is what I'm mainly talking about when I say the Wirebugs didn't necessarily have to change the combat pace so drastically. Simply with the removal of the Wirefall, Rise's pace would be a lot slower, but because this mechanic is here, combat in Monster Hunter has never been faster. And like most mechanics in Rise, the idea isn't terrible, it's the execution that is lacking. So where's the main problem with the Wirefall? Well, it's its cost. If the Wirefall cost 2 Wirebugs instead of 1, it'd be a more interesting mechanic since there would be a choice to make. But the Wirefall is too cheap, therefore there are almost no situations in which you can Wirefall that you would choose not to do so. Of course, there are exceptions. A lot of the attacks in the final boss fight have huge areas of effect, so you might need to take advantage of the invulnerability frames when getting up, and sometimes you need to conserve a Wirebug during the Magnamolo fight in order to get rid of the Hellfire effect, but those are the exceptions to the rule. For the most part, wirefalling is what you always do after being knocked down, to the point where it even becomes muscle memory. Like, I found myself going back to World or MHGU and instinctively pressing the wirefall buttons when I get knocked down. Now, some people might not see this as a problem, but I do think it makes Monster Hunter a lot less unique from other action games, as one of the things that separates Monster Hunter from other games is how punishing getting hit can be. The risk of going for high commitment moves is truly exhilarating when you know if you get hit, you're going to be punished quite a bit. But in Rise, getting hit isn't really a problem unless it's happening repeatedly in rapid succession, or if you're fighting one of the super apex monsters that can one-shot you. What makes this even worse is how fast healing is in this game. The moment you get hit, you can be back up and at full HP in mere seconds with very little risk and at a very small cost. Like most mechanics in Rise, it is very unbalanced. Now, I do think this lack of balance was intentional in some areas, particularly the wirefall, as the lack of punishment for getting hit makes the combat a lot more forgiving, therefore being a lot more fitting for on-the-go short play sessions. Now, what can we conclude from all I've said so far? Well, I believe the wirebugs, while an interesting mechanic and concept, very negatively impact the combat of Rise through poor balancing and by shifting the combat of Monster Hunter away from its roots and more into a traditional hack and slash. This isn't to say the combat isn't good. Abusing so fine attacks is satisfying. Being able to negate most of the consequences of getting hit provides a more laid back and comfortable experience. And the power fantasy that comes from riding a powerful monster and dealing tons of damage is something most action RPGs wish they could achieve. But it's far from the series' best, and I feel it isn't too representative of the series as a whole. Monster Hunter Rise's combat is great, yet lacks the polish and depth of older games in the franchise because of its poor balancing, fast-paced streamlined nature, and its lack of difficulty. Apart from problems with the Wirebug, Rise has some other balance problems with its weapons and the switch skills. These are general issues, so I'll just be listing them without going into too much detail. So the first problem that many people already know is the longsword, which I already talked about. It's very strong with many options that have no risk but all the reward. Apart from that, there is a serious issue in the functionality of the bow. It's broken not in a figurative sense, but like in that it literally does not function as intended. You see, when you shoot an arrow, you can follow up with a power shot. This is supposed to be like a way to commit more in exchange for more damage. Risk reward, you know, the pillar of good combat design. But in Rise, if you dash before shooting an arrow, you can cancel instantly into a power shot, removing all of the risk and keeping all of the reward. What is it with Rise and doing that? So yeah, one of the most important skills to master for effective bow play, knowing when to go and when not to go for a power shot, is just removed in Rise. The other problem is some switch skills are just kinda bad, which is a problem Generations had too with the hunting styles and hunter arts. Those things are hard to balance, so I'll give the game a pass for that one. But now on to the more important discussion, the difficulty. Y'all have probably heard talk about this already, but MH Rise is quite a lot easier than other entries in the series, and I would have to agree with this claim. The issue isn't the monster's AI or anything like that. In fact, some monsters have more dangerous movesets than they've ever had before. The problem comes from the amount of HP the monster has and the amount of damage the monster can deal in relation to how much damage the player can deal and how easily the player can recover from being hit. You see, because of Rise mechanics, the only way to make a challenging fight is by either giving the monster's attacks with very wide areas of effect to bait a wirefall, or by giving the monster the ability to one-shot, or at least the ability to deal about 80 to 90% of your HP in one hit, which they do the former in the final boss and the latter in the emergency apex quests. This is because if a monster deals 50% or less damage with an attack, the player can just wirefall away and heal back to full incredibly fast with very little risk. If the monster is like Narwa, then wirefalling becomes a risk, since sometimes you need to use your get up invisibility frames to not get comboed to death. This is a flaw with the game, since boosting damage and health numbers shouldn't be the only way to make monsters harder. Other games in the franchise never had this problem, since healing required such a large commitment. And even in Worlds, since there is no wirefall, sometimes you need to think about when to heal. But in Rise, the difficulty is severely lowered, because how could it not be? With these mechanics, it is clear that the lower difficulty of this game was 100% intentional in order to facilitate on-the-go short play sessions. Another thing that adds to this game just being easier in general is how most weapons have some sort of counter, so you can rely much more on pure reflexes than proper planning and positioning. Overall, this game is just a lot easier, which makes each fight feel less unique and memorable, since it's very unlikely any of them will be a wall, and the progression feels a lot less satisfying, since there is never fear instilled in you about facing a monster alone. Therefore, if there is no fear to begin with, then there is no fear to conquer, making the general feeling of growing stronger less satisfying than in previous entries. Okay, so now for a rapid fire of things in the game I just didn't quite vibe with. First, I think the UI is kinda not too pretty, especially the damage numbers. They just look very in your face and intrusive. Hitting enemies isn't as satisfying as in other games, like the particle effects are uglier, the sound effects are really not the best, and a lot of the times these particles just cause too much visual clutter. They removed arm wrestling, which like, why would you do that? And they also removed this really cool thing from World where you could like catch endemic life and put them in your room, but hopefully that'll be added in the expansion. Now for some gunner talk, because believe it or not, this is really important to me. They added back deviation, which kinda sucks, but it ain't that bad. More importantly, they removed the damage boost from heavy bowgun. Now heavy bowguns simply just do more raw, which removes a lot of the reason you would want to use a heavy bowgun. They also removed the other main difference between light and heavy bowgun, which is their ammo capabilities. Like, let's look at the difference between spread 3 LBG and spread 3 HBG in Iceborne. Here, I'm using the best spread HBE versus the best spread LBG with the same skills on my armor. Now, first of all, the HBG does 47 per pellet versus the 42 per pellet of the LBG. There's 7 pellets in one shot, so the HBG would do about 35 extra damage per shot than the LBG. Not that much, right, considering the massive sacrifice of mobility you have to make in order to use the HBG. But the damage difference isn't the only thing that differentiates these bowguns' DPS capabilities. You see here, the heavy bowgun has 6 shots without ammo up and normal reload, meanwhile the LBG has 3 shots without ammo up and slow reload, which equates to an extra 1092 damage per magazine on the heavy bowgun. For this reason, even though the numbers are not that different, the DPS difference is huge. So for the LBG, you get less DPS in exchange for more mobility and ease of use. Now let's compare this to Rise using Femento's 2 Rajang speedruns. First thing you might notice right off the bat is the difference in speed of these runs is only 10 seconds, which when translated into just regular high-skill Monster Hunter gameplay, it's practically nothing. Like, in fact, you and I and most regular players will find ourselves having faster LBG runs more consistently because of how easy it is to use versus heavy bowgun. Now let's look at the damage. LBG does an average of 27 per pellet and HBG does an average of 30 per pellet. That's only a 3 damage per pellet difference, which ends up being about a 21 damage difference per shot, which would be only 105 extra damage per magazine. Why only 105 extra damage, you ask? Well, it's because in Rise, both the LBG and HBG have the same clip size, same reload speed, and same recoil. So HBG is only slightly better than LBG, and only in a very specific speedrun setting. For 90% of players, the trade-off is not worth it, since LBG is just so much easier to use for nearly the same damage. Sure, the HBG has shields and Wyvern Heart and Wyvern Snipe, which are fun to use, but these tools don't really add any more damage and are generally weaker to use than just not using them. And remember, my argument isn't that HBG isn't fun to use. In fact, I love using it. My argument is once again that there is a lack of balance in this game's design. Balance doesn't just come from motion values, but from the trade-offs you need to make in order to use certain weapons. The rule should always be that if something is easier to use, it should perform worse in relation to said ease of use. This is all speaking from a solo hunt perspective. The game can be as unbalanced as it wants in multiplayer, I don't really care. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the final big problem with Monster Hunter Rise. Monster Hunter Rise goes back to the progression structure of older Monster Hunter games. albeit with one key difference. Village and hub separation is back, and key quests are also back, but not only can you do them in any order, but also you do not have to do all of them. This one on one hand is good because it gives the player more freedom, but on the other hand it also makes pacing the game a lot harder since there is no way to know which key quest the player will decide not to do. This isn't necessarily bad, and while I prefer the more cinematic linear progression of world that really makes each new hunt feel like an event, Rise's approach is valid too. Where the main problem with Rise's progression lies is difficulty and pacing. Let's start with the latter. Rise really struggles with its pacing because most of its content is found within the first 15 to 30 hours of the game. A majority of the monsters are fought in low rank, so high rank ends up just repeating the same content with urgent quests being new monsters. Unlike in World, where basically every quest was an urgent. One of Rise's biggest disappointments was letting us fight Magnamolo so early and at such a low difficulty. It really took away some of that classic Monster Hunter motivation where you spend many hours getting ready to face the game's flagship as one of the end bosses, and it's a really huge event. Like Nergigante in World, that fight is being teased the whole game, and when you fight him, not only are you nearing the end game, but he's really tough. In Rise, you just kind of fight Magnamolo hella early, and if you did Village, he's pretty much a pushover. He feels like just any regular monster, which is terrible considering he's the flagship. Rise's progression feels really disappointing, not just because of its pacing, but because of its difficulty. There are really no walls in Rise, even for players of low skill levels. Upgrading equipment is extremely easy and seamless, requiring practically no grinding to beat the campaign, which in turn makes every new hunt feel less important. Aside from the final bosses and maybe Valstrax, every other hunt feels so underwhelming. And this isn't helped by the fact that you have to stop in a couple points during the campaign to do the Rampage quests. These quests are just fucking terrible. They lack everything that makes Monster Hunter's combat engaging. They're just impossible to lose unless you purposefully try, and they're so time consuming. These are just atrocious. The moment I did my first ever Rampage quest, I knew I never wanted to do it again in my life, but you have to do it a minimum of 3 times to beat the game, which if you ask me is 3 too many. This game also suffers from a lack of content in comparison to other Monster Hunter games. Like, on its own, it has a shit ton to do, but as a spiritual successor to one of the most content-rich Monster Hunter games, it's kinda disappointing. There are plenty of other issues with Rise I failed to mention. The terrible charm melding system, the lackluster event quests, the HR grind necessary to fight the final story boss, the terrible elemental damage balancing, the shitty layered weapon system, the artificial difficulty in exchange for nothing of the emergency Apex quest, and probably much more that I'm just forgetting to mention. I also failed to mention lots of good things with Rise, like the vertical map design that makes traversing with the Wirebug very enjoyable, the spirit birds rewarding hunters for exploration, the Palamutes, and once again, probably much more that I'm failing to remember. The conclusion that I want to arrive at with this video isn't that Rise is a bad game or even a bad Monster Hunter game, whatever that means, but that Rise at its current state is a very shallow, disappointing experience, and that there needs to be more understanding towards the players who dislike this game. Instead of calling them out or treating them like clowns or ungrateful gamers, understand that Rise is disappointing, and currently, if you haven't bought it already, I'd say at this point just wait for Sunbreak. Because right now, Monster Hunter Rise is truly an underwhelming experience. Hey guys, once again, it is I, Feels, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. It really took a lot out of me to make it. I even got a little bit lazy towards the ending, you know, not editing as much as I should, but I really wanted to get my opinion on this game out there, and it actually means a lot to all of you who made it to this insane point into the video, right? It's a fucking long video, and if you made it here, you guys are genuinely the goats. But with that said, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and maybe even like the video, comment too. That helps the algorithm get it out there, and
who knows, maybe even ring that notification bell, you know, so that you'll get notified whenever my next review comes out. I know I haven't uploaded in a year, but I'm really motivated to try and be a little bit more active now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and Elden Ring, just a week away. Let's go!